Yeah, my name is Brett Smith, and echo Peter's sentiments. Thank you very much for your time tonight, and thanks for having us along. I represent the art group, the proponent, the purchaser of the land, the developer, whatever you want to call us. Having the entire estate, the entire site under our control. And there's a bit of a process around how we need to deliver the site, which we'll go into in a moment for your information and understanding. But I'll let Rob just give you a little intro to himself.
Good evening, I'm Rob Morton. I'm with Cox Architecture, and it's always a pleasure.
You guys should move around here.
Yeah.
See, people are going to be coming in and probably want to sit there and look at the...
Sure. Yep.
Yeah. So now, why do you guys... So, what can I say?
Good try, good try.
Good try. Just stay where you are.
Okay. So obviously...
I'm just noticing what's happening, and everything's 180 degrees out.
Right. Well, you know, people will come in, but we think we should just press on and join in the conversation.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is a conversation, and that's probably why we don't have a formal electronic presentation. This is just some of the material which presented at last week's broader community drop-in consultation session. But it's always a pleasure to sit down and talk to people about what it is we're doing, because we're passionate about what we do. This particular site along Northbourne, we have been, in terms of our role, working as planners with the government to sort of understand what would be appropriate for this site and the site across the road. Obviously, it was delivered back in the 60s as a precinct by Anchor Mortlock-Woolley, way back then. And so it's a pretty prominent site which has a number of things happening around it in the next 5 or so years, with the Northbourne corridor and the rail or tram or whatever you like to call it happening down through the site. So as I said, we'll hand back to Peter and Brett to take you through the process, but welcome any thoughts that you've got for this session.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. So just for your information, we went out to, as soon as we acquired the site, we went out to a local design competition. We invited some local architects to participate in a concept master plan arrangement. We went through and scrutinised the submissions and awarded Cox the master planning work. So what we're going to show you tonight is effectively part of that submission in terms of how we determined the best approach to the site. The planning approach to this one is a little unique in that the Northbourne corridor guidelines have been out in somewhat of a draft form prior to the election, and I'm sure that you would have had a chance to have a look at those and maybe make some comments back to the Territory. That document hasn't yet evolved to the point of being publicly available for any further comment. So it's actually evolved in terms of the work done behind it, but it's not yet been through the Minister's office such that it can come out to the broader community, and including ourselves. So effectively, the way that the Territory are approaching the site with us, in the absence of some of that detail, is to have a master plan exercise run. So we have to produce a master plan that's going to be fully consulted with the community and with the Territory and stakeholders, including the National Capital Authority. We have to get pre-endorsement effectively for what we propose in that master plan prior to moving into an estate development plan arrangement, of which again has to be fully consulted with the stakeholders, all of the elements within the Territory in terms of their asset acceptance, roads and those types of entities. That then has to be endorsed by the Territory before we can lodge that, which then goes through its normal circulation process, through a normal DA process. So there's quite a bit of consultation and quite a bit of work we have to do with the Territory, which is not normally how you might see some of these proponent schemes come through. And I suppose that's in recognition of the prominence of the scheme, one of the first ones to go out as a large parcel of land, and something that the Territory is very down at the Pavilion. So we had a first round of consultation there, which was a drop-in session. We'll do another one that will show a little bit of an evolved process and some more resolution in terms of the planning work at that session. We will set up a website that will give you all of this information. Anything that we've provided to the community will publish publicly, and we will set up that website such that we can take comments and set up a repository of information and comments back, so that Campbell Town Planning can make something of that in terms of the consultation report. So for those who can't quite see, feel free to step up. I'll sort of talk generally to the drawings, just so that you get a bit of context.
Good for people to come around the table.
This is essentially a set of drawings that Cox worked through to get, I suppose, a conceptual master plan or a rhythm on the site. For those who aren't quite sure or orientated, Northbourne runs up and down the page, so each of these are exactly the same plan. So Northbourne is up the page, and Morford Street running across the top effectively, so that the light rail down the side there. The site is set up in 3 different blocks. Essentially, they work something like about that one, and that one, and the Territory are asking us to settle those progressively over the course of 3 years, with that one being June 17, June 18 and June 19. And that one is being preserved solely at the moment for use by the proponent in delivering the light rail corridor. So that's their side sheds effectively.
That's the old thing.
The old bit of the centre. Yeah. What you can see in terms of these little boxes here are the heritage examples that are mandatory to maintain, refurbish and adapt in terms of a future use. There's quite a bit of work that we have to do in terms of those heritage arrangements, predominantly to the exterior of the buildings. The interior of the buildings, there's no real requirement to do anything with those other than repurpose them, so we can effectively gut the buildings and set them up in a totally different configuration. What we do with those is still a matter of a lot of discussion and working out how we can best integrate those and celebrate those as the heritage status that they. So what Cox did through these series of drawings, and then started to look at the massing and what that sets up in terms of the dimensions of the sites. That then worked through what's the total developable area, staying out of these heritage curtilages, with a little bit of exception of what happens up on the top here. They then started to work that into a more stageable program of buildings. They then started to look at some of the requirements in the deed about providing some cross linkages from the existing streets in Dixon through to the Northbourne corridor, and then looking at what that then does to break down a little bit more articulation and rhythm of the building. So this is what we end up with today. So any questions on those first few drawings?
So these are really just diagrams at this point, to sort of so you can sort of understand what our design approach might have been back then. But as it was quite important for Brett to sort of say, because when people look at these drawings, because of the nature of what we had to do to win the job, they're quite resolved. But these drawings were, as Brett had indicated, were something that we did as architects to sort of predetermine an outcome so that we could demonstrate to our client that we were the right firm for the site. So in that regard, there's still an awful lot of water to go under the bridge in terms of mixing this up and arranging it and going through the whole process.
So again, all part of the same submission. This is I suppose a more detailed look at where we ended up with that last vignette there, and the program of architecture as it sets out on the site. And what we asked for in the brief was some exploration in terms of some mix of uses. We didn't want to see, for example, a 500 metre length of residential development. We wanted to see what the opportunities were and how an architect would approach it from a planning perspective to set it up in those different uses. So what you can see in this drawing is a bit of a understanding or a representation from Cox about how they saw the site setting up. Again, the first stage being this one, which will be settled in 6 months' time, 6 or 7 months' time. So the idea there was to look at a residential play, something that can move a little bit quicker without having to find tenants or other other sale options, a pretty standard sort of play. The next one is set up as a potential retirement play, some potential aged care, something of that nature, and again, completely conceptual at this point, perhaps something that could be adapted later to be office or to be residential or to be anything else for that matter. This site here, they looked at providing an office building, and the reason for that being that the site actually opens up a little bit wider through there, so if you're going to put office in that space, it makes a little bit more sense to put it in there where the floor plates can be a little bit larger and a little bit more commensurate with that type of use. We then have a heritage precinct through here, which you recall from that drawing there is the little garden apartments through the back there. So there's 4 single-storey buildings in there, and then we've got the masonettes through here, which is the 6 party-walled, 3-storey heritage-listed places, which pose quite a few challenges for us. And the idea here was to try and slot a hotel or something of that nature in the centre of that, so that we could activate the precinct and then perhaps tie some of those heritage elements into that sort of use where we could repurpose those assets appropriately.
What would the heritage be used for?
Good question.
Yeah, and if anyone's got any comments, we'd be very happy to take them on board.
Yeah, well, I think with all, Brett will continue to roll through all of this, but that's the real sort of challenge that we have here, is to put a meaningful reuse to these, repurpose to these buildings, because we don't want them to just remain as sort of museums. We want them to be actively used and to invigorate the precinct. And you know, if that means that potentially these could be things that relate to a hotel use, well then that'd be great. Perhaps they could be sort of family accommodation for people looking for like a hotel rather than, you know, just business people. So we need to explore all of those options.
So what building is that at the moment?
That doesn't exist at the moment. That's purely proposed. Yeah. So this one exists,
So which is the heritage?
and those 4 exist, and this front one exists, and this little box exists. So that's the 4-storey one that you can see that's been preserved behind the hoarding at the moment. That's it. These ones down here, there's actually a series of these, so picking that one out of the lineup is a little bit difficult. And at the back here, you'll see these garden apartments. These run the entire length. And there's the example that's preserved. So this is on the back street. This street actually exists. There's actually some roads that run through here. They'll all be de-gazetted by the Territory and handed back, and we'll settle the land as a vacant block.
So the context to the heritage decision, some of you may be familiar with, was that after a long process, which we were involved, the government made a decision to retain a representative example of the 5 different building types which are on the site. So the bed sits, the garden flats, the masonettes, and then there are 2 other types on this site as well, which are being retained as a sort of a representative sample of what was once on the site. So that's one of the key challenges for us to work through.
So as we move further down the south of the site and effectively what the Territory are currently considering a second stage of development, there's obviously a wider element of land, or a wider area of land. So we see that as being, yeah, it's a block of that, thanks. See that as being more of an active ground plane, so whether it's a pattern of cafes, restaurants, or some sort of activity at that ground level that brings the community in and obviously services and provides amenity for the entire area. So that's essentially where we are at the moment, and we're starting to work through now, particularly that first stage of development at the northern end of the site, and what opportunities that presents, as well as the challenges that it presents around some of that heritage, those heritage elements. So a lot of work to be done in terms of traffic management, parking provisions, waste management, all of those sort of services arrangements. We have to look at a full understanding of what service augmentation may be necessary. We have to do full surveys about what the current capacities are of those services, water, sewer, stormwater, etc., and work through a process of how we provide a greater level of development through those services and what that will necessarily mean. So we don't have a whole lot more to show you. I mean, we are literally quite embryonic in terms of our process here. We're very early. What I would say is that we will look at a pattern of development that has the ability to adapt over time. We see this site possibly being around in terms of development for the next 8 to 10 years in reality. And you know, over that time, markets will shift, maybe from residential to a different type of use, maybe commercial is more prominent, and hotel. Development happening up and down the corridor. Whether we can sustain another one in here will be a matter of finding an appropriate hotelier that's got interest in the site and managing their requirements. In terms of retail and supermarket, we'll look to try and attract some sort of opportunity down there to service predominantly the immediate community, but something a little bit broader out of Dickson, and we know what's going on in Dickson, and there's still quite a bit to happen up there, but we think that there's probably the necessity to start dealing with a higher level of development and a lot more people along the corridor. So we'll look at all those sorts of opportunities as well. So that's essentially where we're at. I don't have a whole lot more to share with you. The rest of the submission from Cox was quite aesthetic and lots of sample images which don't necessarily give you a lot of detail other than a bit of more of an emotional experience where the architect foresaw the opportunity, not necessarily that we're there 100% at the moment. So there's probably not a whole lot of requirement or relevance, to be honest, to show you in that sort of stuff. But that's where we're at, and we're happy to take comments, questions.
Do you know where the tram stop is at all? Where it'll be stopping on this?
They're actually at either
Still working
ends.
it
No,
out.
there's one sort of, it gets down more towards Wakefield, and there's one more outside where the bus terminal is currently being constructed up near the Transact building.
So there's not really one that's...
Someone already at the site. I think the northern line is about 100 metres upstream, and the one downstream is quite...
That's about a 500 metre frontage to Northbourne, so it's a pretty significant length of land. Yeah, when you drive past it,
So-
it's 30, 40 goes.
And that's the real challenge, is how do you break down 500 metres so it doesn't feel, that it feels like it has a degree of difference. And, mixed use isn't about having everything the same but then just doing something different at ground floor. It's about having, a clearly identifiable area here, I think, and then something different happening here, and then trying to get sustainable mixed use, something that's going to be active, to do it over the whole precinct, I think is probably unachievable, and we'll end up with a result which a lot of mixed use precincts, which they take 10 years to actually get to have a soul and to have a sort of a vibrancy about it.
What we have done is engaged a firm, Dionysus is their name, and they are a cultural consultant, and had a lot to do with the activation of the new Acton precinct. So we've engaged those guys to come in and help us deliver, I suppose, a consistency throughout the whole estate that provides a level of cultural activity, and that will be demonstrated through the landscape architecture, a consistent approach to landscape architecture, artworks, and we're currently talking about some opportunity to maybe have an ever-changing palette of artworks rather than a static one. So that will be a consistent approach throughout the estate, to the extent that we can satisfy many masters at this point in time.
The old tourist info centre, approximately where would that be? In the middle? Yeah, okay. Yeah. And you were saying, starting at the northern end, 2017, and then the southern end, 2018, and the middle, right?
2019. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And look, I suspect that's purely around whatever they promised in the light rail contract, and it doesn't necessarily do us any favours in terms of servicing and cutting it off in the middle. It doesn't give us a consistent approach to servicing, but they're things that we'll have to work through and figure out the most logical sequence of events. What I can say, and it's completely devoid of any territory inputs or support, is that there's a almost a shared zone or a traffic lane down the back which would be privatised, and the idea there is to try and, I suppose, leave as much as possible an uninterrupted Northbourne verge so that we're not taking a lot of traffic on and off Northbourne and not necessarily dragging too much in off the back streets either. As I said, there's got to be a lot of discussion with Roads ACT and
So
TCCS.
The residents will end up coming out there, won't
Well, to some extent, yes, they will come out to
they? Do they have
Morford.
any other options?
Well, there's not a whole lot of other options, particularly for this top end, but we will have to get some sort of drain coming out to Northbourne to some extent. But what we are keen to explore is a significant reduction in parking generation, given it's sitting on the light rail, and try to provide a marketable approach to traffic to parking provisions. And that's again something that we need to talk with the Territory. We don't have a provision or a code or a standard to refer to. So at the moment it's all about the discussion with the stakeholders in the community.
I have a question about stakeholders, and that is, who do you actually see as stakeholders?
It's a good question. It's essentially being run out of the Office of Coordinator General. So they are coordinating the approach through urban renewal. So it's the Office of Coordinator General Urban Renewal is essentially, it has taken the lead in terms of a coordination effort for the Territory. They're not necessarily the approving authority or the reporting authority, but they're a coordinating entity for us to, I suppose, get all of the stakeholders into the one place so that we can have a meaningful discussion. So EPD is still the assessing authority. They will still effectively run the DA for the EDP. And if I'm using any acronyms that anyone doesn't understand, please call me up. And the EPD will still do the assessing on the DAs. Their National Capital Authority were a referral entity, given their prominence on the major corridor. But it's essentially the same players that you currently know, with the exception that we've got a coordinating entity that is trying to run a process that's a little unusual.
You interrupted you, you're going to ask a question.
So I think my husband said the height limit is 3 stories or something.
The height limit currently in the National Capital Plan is 25 metres, which essentially, depending on how you cut it, whether it's residential, commercial, etc., it could be anything from 6 to 9 stories.
25 metres is 9 stories. Okay.
Yeah, there were 25, well, there are 9-storey buildings in there now, 25 metres. And I'm not sure if that's
So in other words, trying to go with the tree line isn't going to happen. Is that what you're saying?
Well, no, the tree line as it exists, I think, depending on how many trees are left in the village.
Well, I'm thinking in terms of what the normal street trees would be. So in other words, we're not talking about 3 stories or 4 stories. We're talking about something a lot taller.
Yes. And that's essentially the pattern of development for the entire corridor, so that's not just this site.
I know that is because I guess I have the same issue with the whole corridor in that regard. But, yeah.
I'll go back to engagement too. You said you're going to be with the master plan and going to consult with the community. That's again through the Office of Coordinator General?
No, that's an obligation on us that we need to come out and do our own community consultation. That's not something that is being demanded in any further effort from the Office of Coordinator General. That's something that we're required to do as part of our standard DA process.
And you can't even go through that.
Well, that's what we're here doing.
You're doing that one, yes, but that's not the full committee. That's a representative and some wonderful people have come as well.
Well, we went out to our first drop-in consultation meeting last week. So we promoted that, and as I said, we've got another one on the 15th of December.
Out of that process, we have given Bond Coordinator General full list of contacts that we used in the initial work they've done on the corridor and the work in the gateway strategy workshops. So we've invited each and every one of those people that are on the north side of Canberra has got an interest, as well as all of the Canberra White groups. We've letterbox dropped about 1,000 dwellings in this area. We've had 2 runs in the paper, and there will be an ad, I think, tomorrow and another one next week for the next consultation. And the whole idea is that it's not just 1 or 2 sessions that we're done. This is something that will involve sort of build as we work through the process. And we see many opportunities for people. And I mean, ultimately, once the website's up, it gives another avenue. And at the moment, we're trying not only to go out and talk to people, but also give the opportunity to let interested parties that put their hand on and say, we want to be part of the process. So we actually built a database of interested stakeholders, other than just the government or the usual suspects, so to speak.
And you're going to have a list of those who wish to be visible on your website?
Oh, if people want to be visible, I'm pretty sure we could.
I'm not sure. We'll have to check some policy. There's some privacy
There's
issues
privacy
around
there.
there.
If they wish to be.
Yeah.
That's what I
Well,
said.
if for example, you thought that you wanted to bring people into this environment or wanted to consult in more detail, then we'd be happy to promote you as a
I was just saying,
Yes,
obviously
it
the
is.
caveat is if they wish to be.
So essentially, we're just consulting on the master plan at this stage. Obviously, there'll be a whole other range of requirements in terms of individual DAs, and there will be a number of them, obviously. So we will have to consult with those and prepare those almost in isolation, I suppose, as an addition to this.
I mean, so we've got the master plan and the work we're doing now, then we've got a number of urban applications from the state all the way through specific buildings, and there will be 4 of those be requirements for pre-consultation as per legislation, and for specific DAs, and then there's the public notification period while these DAs are being done. So, and all through that we want to, it's a long project, Brett's talking about a number of years, and we really understand that to be successful with this project, we need to have a journey with the interested parties in the community through the process to make sure we do this properly.
The truth of pudding will be, as always, whether the consultations are meaningful. You know, I mean, I was in another world. I used to engage in a lot of consultation with the Americans. It was never meaningful because it was just a joke. We just went through a consultation process and I said, thanks very much indeed, and nothing happened. So, I mean, without being too cynical at all, just if we're going to have consultations, hopefully, you know, we get a responsive side of the...
Absolutely. I mean, I think the fact that we're sitting here tonight with the government table, it's not a resolved plan at all. It's, you know, a few weeks of work of some of the work Cox has done initially. We're here to actually, I mean, we actually want to say, listen, you guys talk back to us. I'm not going to come back to this. Well, actually tell us about what you know and what you're interested in.
Yeah.
So we can start working some of those ideas.
So it's as good as both what we put on the table for you guys, but it's also about what sort of type of comments we get back, and you know how that can be considered along with all the other discussion and feedback we're going to get from NCA and government and all of those bodies together. Because we won't be doing anything until we've received all of that feedback and we understand the issues at hand. So
I think one of the things you can do to demonstrate genuine consultation, to pick up your point, is to show them that you are listening by writing up on the website that you have heard, and then if you can't follow that particular suggestion, why? And I think that's sort of, if you can demonstrate you are listening and say, we have heard this particular comment, yes, we're taking that into consideration and this is what we're going to do, but then you also should do the same sort of thing when you can't do something for whatever reason. That demonstrates a level of authenticity in your approach to genuine consultation. It's been done with other government agencies. I'm talking the Commonwealth here mainly, but I think you've got to be able to show that people who come and give up their time and make a suggestion are being heard. Otherwise, like you're saying, you just dismiss it as a tick the box. We spoke to people. So yes, I put the onus back on you to demonstrate that, and your website is one of the best ways of doing it.
Yeah, that's a good comment. We'll definitely take that challenge on board.
It is a challenge.
And we will do what we can with you, and we're more than happy to come out and talk with you as often as you would like. We certainly don't want to waste your time and take up your meeting space with stuff that hasn't sufficiently evolved or may not be anything new for you to see, but to the extent that you think that you need an update, by all means, please let us know. And we'll make ourselves available to do that.
Perhaps when you've sort of developed it to the next stage, or
Of
the
course,
stage after,
of course.
you can let us know that you've got something new to show us.
Yeah, we see that as essential. I mean, we don't want to, as Rob suggested, get too far down the line and and things start to evolve rapidly, and it gets very difficult to pull it back. And that was the reason that we were very pleased to be able to come in and see you in your community meeting rather than a general consultation meeting where we didn't really want to wait till your next meeting in February, because some things will happen if we can keep consultants working over Christmas to evolve it sufficiently. We're on a reasonably tight time frame. There's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of inputs that have to happen, but we're constrained to settling a third of the site that is in reality, in terms of yield, probably 20% of it rather than 33% of it. So we need to find some ways to deal with that in a very quick period of time, so that we're not essentially put under so much pressure at the front end of the project that makes everything else go a lot slower, and it makes it a lot more difficult. So those are things we're grappling with at the moment.
I mean, your overall plans for the site. So basically, it is very close to the Dixon shopping precinct. If you're talking about putting retail hub in and hotel, are you looking essentially? Are you waiting to see what happens with Dixon? With all the construction there, is to see whether the retail sort of backs off a bit there, and then you're going to put retail in down there and essentially move the retail core.
No, I wouldn't suggest that we're looking to move anything that's happening currently at Dixon, and I'm sure you guys are far more aware than probably I am about what's happening up there. But all we would be looking to do, I suppose, is provide a level of amenity that is palatable and marketable in the precinct for the local existing community and the future community there. It's got to be something that we can both accommodate and will be accepted in terms of retailers wanting to invest in that sort of space.
So you're looking to sort of, the setup, it's a little core there, but it's still very close to the shopping precinct at Dixon, so it's going to essentially, take away people that would normally go to Dixon.
We've looked at Dixon in a lot of detail actually, and our cultural guys have been into that, and they've done some demographic research into what kind of happens in Dixon. We don't want to compete, we want to augment or support it in something that's a little different, so that there's a choice. We wouldn't necessarily replicate what's happening in Dixon. I don't think that it makes a whole lot of sense to try and compete and drag people away. It's somewhere between a Braddon and a Dixon sort of arrangement where we'll try to create its own environment, and I don't know what that looks like yet. And essentially it's going to be subject to retailers having an appetite to effectively try and set up another precinct. If that's not there, then we'll have to explore other opportunities down there. But it's not something that we're looking to replicate in terms of Dixon. I think that's got its own...
Yeah, it's got its own entity, but it's still going to, being so close, it's still going to split
We're talking about putting another couple of thousand people in there too, so whilst that might help Dixon thrive a little more, I think that the rhythm of development and the quantum of development that's proposed for the corridor is going to need
a bit more support. So that's what you're basing your commercial sort of intent on, so supporting that factor.
You'll have a couple of thousand people living in this area, in this particular development, is that right?
Working hourly.
Yeah, there will be.
It depends on the mix, because how much of it's commercial, how much of it's residential, all those sorts.
Because if you're going to have any successful retail, it's going to have enough people living close enough to it that they will go there rather than go to somewhere like Dixon.
Yeah, completely agree.
I'm guessing you're not going to put in another Woolies there, for example. But you might have another Chinese restaurant.
It could be. I mean, if we can create the space, we can curate the space. We can't necessarily control the retail environment unless we retain and manage the tenants that we want. Effectively, those places start taking a bit of a life of their own, and investors will come in, potentially purchase the space or tenant them themselves and create a business. And to the extent that thrives, then other businesses grow around it. They're a little organic in that regard, and I suppose Braddon is a classic example of how that has sort of grown its own sort of lifestyle down there. It was not necessarily deliberate, other than a planning stage or framework that gave them the opportunity to do certain things, and that's grown a life of its own. And this is a much smaller pocket of space. This is something you might see you know, maybe half a dozen or something like that, restaurants, cafes, or different types of retail opportunities. It's not something that we see being, you know, the scale of Dixon by any stretch, or Braden for that matter. What we may try to do is repurpose those heritage elements that you could take something like a small eatery sort of space with a courtyard environment, which would be something rather unique in that space. But again, there's so much exploration we need to do in terms of what we can and can't do in the heritage spaces from a logical and a servicing point of view. And getting services in there, we've still got to get delivery vehicles in there, we've still got to get, you know, waste out, we've still got to get grease traps to work and things like that. So,
would you be looking to like own the commercial space or to sell it off?
Look, at the moment, as the developers would probably be looking at moving it on, there's a heck of a lot of space in there to own, and the repayment requirements on those sorts of things, we need to generate some revenue. So at the moment, that would be the play, but who knows, within the next 10 years that could completely change.
What sort of constraints of the MCA are you saying? You're alluding to the master plan as not having been fully dotted and T'd at the moment, but so it's an evolving document, is it? But is the NCA putting any kind of constraints on this? I mean, what you're saying worries me, because the last thing I would want to see Northbourne Avenue, which to me is fairly close to being a boulevard, turn into something like Parramatta Road, which to me is just a nightmare. And I would hate to see something that is, you know, covered in advertising. To me, Northbourne Avenue leads into the national capital, and it does have a level of gravitas which other entries to other towns around Australia don't have. But so I would hope that the NCA is putting some kind of imprimatur in terms of cohesiveness, integration, I don't know what the architectural appropriate terms are, sympathetic development, so that it's not just piecemeal ad hocery all the way down. And I would certainly hope that, you know, Big W is not all McDonald's great bloody arches are not going to sort of dominate the view. So is the NCA trying to coordinate this in some way?
The NCA have had a lot to do with the Northbourne guidelines and the way that sets up in terms of a rhythm of development for the width or the road reserve, if you like. So you would have noticed that sort of has that level of, I suppose, concentration as it gets closer and closer to the civic centre.
Yeah.
We are a part of that, and the way this sets up is a significant landscape buffer between the boundary and the buildings. So at the moment it's proposed around 10 metres.
Right.
So those sorts of elements are certainly alive from the NCA, and they've had input into the territory's work there. The National Capital Plan is still the overarching document, and we have to be consistent with the National Capital Plan. To that extent, that's about where the National Capital Authority sit, and as a referral entity, and you would no doubt know they are reasonably demanding of high quality design and reasonable facade work and those types of comments that they will provide ad nauseum. So there is definitely the input from the NCA from that regard. The palette of materials and finishes and the liability of maintenance and those sorts of things will still fall back to the territory. We don't have a palette of materials that's consistent, as they have done, for example, on Constitution Avenue. That sort of work doesn't exist, and that's something that we'll be, I suppose, pressing with a number of these stakeholders about how we do that in such a way that it doesn't become a patchwork quilt on the way down the territory. But something that, you know, to be fair, we can't control unless there is a level of work done by an entity that has control over the entire corridor. And I don't think that work, in my understanding, is being done by the National Capital Authority or by the territory at this stage.
That's pretty.
It certainly makes our life a lot easier when they do have a standard approach. And look, I tend to agree that if you've got certain parameters on the verge that you do understand, it makes it a lot easier to approach these things without shooting arrows into the dark and hoping you get target. But it's probably a body of work that's almost racing away in terms of opportunity, because they're starting to release land along that space, and it's, as developers, I don't think we're going to take as long as maybe what the territory of the NCA might do to review all of that sort of stuff in its entirety.
Yes, but
Plan City is running out of
Plan.
I've got a question about the residential developments down here. Obviously, Northbourne is a very busy road, one of the busiest in Canberra. How do you plan to manage the relationship between the traffic going down Northbourne Avenue and the residential areas? I mean, obviously you can put in soundproofing, double glazing, those sorts of things, but people aren't going to want to open their windows to a road carrying, I don't know, 60,000 or 70,000 vehicles a day. And also balconies and things become fairly inhospitable places if they're overlooking a very busy road. Has there been much thought at this stage onto those sorts of issues?
It's probably early days to be giving you specifics around how that will be managed, but it's not indifferent to a number of other capital cities that have similar arrangements, and perhaps there are some good and bad examples out there, but there are plenty of examples around the world how densification on major transport corridors are not necessarily shunned by people that want to live in those sorts of urban environments. But what we're being told by the Territory particularly is how they see the road actually quieten down a little bit with, I suppose, a little bit more activity around there, and the light rail picking up hopefully some of the traffic. Well, quietening down in terms of speed, I suppose, rather than buses racing down the side.
Actually, you will have more cars travelling faster in the left lane of Northbourne Avenue than you have now, because they don't have to slow down for the buses. Once the buses are gone.
Well, outside of the boundary, I can't necessarily control the way that the traffic behaves, notwithstanding the fact that we're going to have to get it on and off. But there'll be options for people to either choose to be part of the urban environment or be part of the quieter environment at the rear, perhaps, because there'd be options for east and west. The way that the site sets up, it's very north-south set up, so the double-loaded, efficient sort of floor plates in terms of residential. You get essentially the same unit on either east or west, so you have those choices. But there's still a lot of development up and down, residential development up and down the corridor that does quite well in terms of market acceptance and uptake. So definitely things that need to be considered, and definitely things that need to be addressed in terms of quiet enjoyment and amenity, but not something that we see as being a major opposition.
So your first block settles June next year. Would you expect to be putting in your first DA around that time, or?
All things being equal, yes. We would like to be progressed to the point where we've got our master plan essentially endorsed. And bear in mind, the master plan is reasonably flexible. It's not a whole lot of detail in there, but it will set up the principles, particularly around yields and generation rates, so that the EDP will essentially sit behind that and has to go in either with or before our first design and siting DA. So the services, the engineering elements behind that sit in the EDP, we do want to see resolved largely by the time we settle that first site. And we do hope to be able to have the first design and siting DA going with that EDP. So yes, middle of next year, we would think that we will have fully consulted, endorsed, and had support of the majority of stakeholders and community, so that we can launch that sort of work.
And somewhere around spring, something will spring out of the ground and grow up and build it.
Well, hopefully it's a whole lot of buyers, because that's going to have to happen before we spring out of the ground. So I wouldn't think, in reality, you'll see a whole lot of work on the site, maybe even next year. It may be pushing into 18 in all reality. And look, if we could be working on the site by January 18 in terms of construction, I would be pretty pleased. There's just so much work to be done on this front end. It's such a large site. There's so many unknowns for us at the moment that don't necessarily exist in terms of statutory guidelines. Hence the process of going through a lot of this stakeholder management and engagement. And to be fair, a lot of those are going to find some conflicts in there that we're going to need to resolve on the way through. So it won't all be a matter of sitting around the table and saying we all agree on this. That's great, go do that. So we're going to have to work through that logically and get to a position where we can move forward.
In terms of
tourists, is there going to be anything in this development that would be like using those heritage sites as tourist places?
We have met with Canberra Museum and Gallery, and as you know, they manage 3 of the historic homesteads in that current arrangement. They've expressed some interest in looking at options in there. We're not sure if it quite sets up in such a way that that would make sense, purely because of some of the issues around public accessibility, servicing and managing the heritage components of those sites. So they're not necessarily large, low buildings, they're taller, smaller components. So we've just started having those discussions about what the Territory think may be an appropriate use for them. We do know that the Territory, through their own admission, did some work into repurposing some of those historic elements in that sort of capacity, but couldn't necessarily find the viability in them for a number of those reasons. So they're things that are still on the table, but so is everything in those heritage buildings. They're just, there's a lot of consideration that needs to still go into how we can successfully return those to a viable, usable space.
It's just like how do you get the public in there if it becomes just private buildings, really? Does it have any public?
The interesting part about the heritage preservation is it's purely facade. There is no heritage preservation inside whatsoever, and there are probably a number of good reasons for that in terms of the space. Even in a communal sort of element, trying to get more than 2 people in some of those spaces is actually a challenge. So whether that would be viable in terms of a communal asset is questionable. Having said that, we think that we have to integrate these buildings and celebrate them for what they are, but work them into I suppose, a contemporary context, and that's going to be a challenge for our design team to make that work, but also a challenge, I think, for Heritage ACT and the Heritage Council to preserve what it is that they intend the buildings to represent, and how we can appropriately integrate them into a pretty contemporary development.
And I presume the National Trust would be interested in having a discussion with you about this sort of thing?
Yeah, so we're talking to all of those elements, and again, I think there's probably a number of different approaches that need to be made from all of those stakeholders, because some of them have differing interests and differing requirements. So pleasing all of the people all of the time is always going to be a challenge. It's something that we will have to do, so we'll continue trying to please.
But I think they've been preserved because of their architectural status. So you're right, people can't view them easily if they want to. I understand that it's been a veneer that's been kept rather than the full experience of what it was like to live in one of those buildings.
Yeah.
But if you can't get access to the people who are interested, architectural students and other people who might be interested in cultural heritage, then it'd be a shame if they can't at least wander around the outside.
Yeah, so we've had a number of those discussions with Heritage ACT, the council representatives and CMAG. We talked in a lot of detail with CMAG about trying to repurpose a living museum type arrangement, which proved had some difficulties, particularly around access and fire and getting services down when these things don't have mechanical or vertical transport or anything like that. So we did explore that, and there are some options perhaps for, if we could get the hotel to work. We discussed, for example, maybe returning some of these buildings to, or some of these units to actually be able to go and stay in a period returned type of approach. But then if we can't get a hotel to work in there, then a 6-room hotel kind of doesn't work. So there are a lot of things that have to line up so that we can get those things to work. But certainly things that we're looking at and exploring. But they'll definitely be accessible from the grounds. We don't intend to gate anything. They'll definitely be able to walk up and check the buildings out. And we want to integrate them into the development and celebrate them, as I said, rather than isolate them and just park them out there and have them looking the way that they do now.
Yeah, I think the most important floor is the ground floor. It always is. So, what happens above the ground floor, sure, it's important in terms of balconies and height and all of that, all of those normal issues. But for us, it's about making the ground level accessible and permeable, because you're quite right, elements of these sites will be less public or more private in certain areas depending upon the uses, but we really need to make sure that the sites are walkable and accessible and all those sorts of things.
And we've spoken about preserving some of the heritage content through photography and artwork and those sorts of things. There are other ways to celebrate the heritage without necessarily having to be inside the buildings. Yeah. So we're definitely working on that stuff. Any other questions? We could leave you those drawings, we can provide them to you electronically. In fact, I think they were provided to you electronically to some extent. So, look, yeah, anything that we have provided to the community, once we get the website live, we'll definitely get those up.
Is it okay for us to put it up on our website, or would you rather we didn't do that until you've done it?
It may be easier to have a single repository, and we can make a reference back to your website if that's something that you see as being appropriate. As an entity?
We'll direct it out to your website.
Yeah. Either way. I just was picking up on your point before about registering an interest or showing a set of comments, which I've assumed was making reference back to the council or something. Perhaps it wasn't.
That can be done either way, but usually with diagrams and more difficultly, more heavy grunt things, you tend to keep them in one place, which would be yours, and we direct people to you. But in terms of engagement, again, I think that yes, we'd also probably suggest we direct it to you, so that you are in control of the comments that are coming to you. So we would say, you wrote reform negotiations. I'm speaking out of turn here, but that's the way we normally go. You'll be holding the information.
Yeah, sure.
And for instance, questions that have come out from this particular forum could be the sort of content you could put up, the questions and some of your edited answers would go on there. That would show that.
We're exploring, for instance, at the moment, because it's quite interesting getting some of the comments we've received back in the first few weeks of doing this. There's already a couple of themes coming through, so we've started working on for want of a better term, general questions or also common questions.
FAQs.
Please don't put the apostrophe in.
It's
just plural.
So we're already exploring those, so yes, that things could work quite well.
Yeah, no, that's good.
And often when people just interested by reading through it, you actually learn and understand a lot more. So we're working on that.
So I assume the council will coordinate a collective comments and send those through.
Actually, could I make a recommendation that you bring a fourth party every time you do a consultation who take notes of the questions, and that whatever consultation period you run or event you run, and then they're yours because you're getting the records.
Always check out the recording.
Oh, yeah. That's one of the good things. We tend to go back to everybody does it online now, and it's engagement with social media.
What we could do, I suppose, is circulate the PDF to our 200 members or so and see, invite them to send comments direct to you, perhaps might get used.
Yeah, for sure. Look, by the 15th of December, which is our next drop-in consultation meeting, we want to have the site live. So we'll be able to refer people, we'll be able to put a little flyer out there at that meeting so that we can direct people as appropriate and they can make comments through that rather than a handwritten piece of paper about the last.
Can we send us the information about the 15th of December registration, circulate that with us?
Oh, yeah. So we've, I think the ads went in the paper today, and within the next few days we'll advise the stakeholders that we're advising the first round, so the council will get specifically.
Seriously would urge you to record the comments that come to you, no matter how you get them, because they are your primary sources for the material. You won't be able to remember it all.
That is probably true. We've already started working on the consultation on the first, before the first meeting, so we had just on the letterbox got comments back. That's already
excellent.
Contact or get captured. So done this a few times. If you don't capture it, 6 months away, you've got it. So, yeah.
All right. Well, we might actually get back to your normal meeting agenda, and if you've got any comments at this point, you'll make it. You've got the email back to Canberra Town Planning if you want to know what's happening. But otherwise, we'll certainly keep you in touch, and we'll let you know where we're at. And if you've got the time, please come and see us on the 15th at the Pavilion. Hopefully, see you.
Good cheese and biggies.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
All right. Thanks very much, mate.
Thank you.
We'll actually do the A ones if you've done those. Unless you want. Unless you want to start wallpaper in the shed or something.
Yeah, the wallpaper shed. You'll be able to do some here.
You can work it as well.